Okay. Welcome everyone to Scientists Warning Europe's Nature Day conference. The first Alliance of World Scientists Warning in 1992 was endorsed by 1,700 scientists, including more than half of the then Nobel laureates at the time. In 2017, a second warning was raised that attracted over 20,000 scientists' signatures, and in 2019, a climate emergency was declared, supported by over 15,000 scientists. On nature, and this is our Nature Day, the World Scientists Warning says we must protect and restore Earth's ecosystems that contribute greatly to sequestration of atmospheric CO2. They say a little more as well, but with no further delay, I want to introduce you now to what I believe will be an eye-opening talk by businessman and environmentalist Mike Sparrow. 5G, high speed into harm without informed consent. Now remember, when you can put questions into the chat box at the bottom of the screen, which Mike will answer later. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this presentation. What I'm going to try and share with you today is not my opinion. It's a summary of sustained research into the rapid proliferation of man-made electromagnetic radiation. And I'm going to try and attempt to put that in context by referring to both the advent of the 5th generation of wireless technology, often referred to as 5G, and the effects of radiation created by the existing technologies that we've come to know. So to make this a little bit easier for you to digest, I'm going to use some slides. I'm going to share those slides with you now, and I'll talk to them as we go through this presentation. So hopefully you can see these slides now. So the night sky, as depicted in this picture, may prove to become a potent symbol of the legacy of technological advancement. For millennia, humankind has looked up to the heavens, used the stars for navigation, honored the constellations for their spiritual meaning, or searched the galaxies for insight into the beginnings of creation. But within the next decade, that night sky will change forever. Mankind has found a new resource to exploit, and perhaps yet another means to contaminate the world in which we live. Amid controversy from astronomers and environmental groups, the Federal Communications Commission in the United States has already authorized launch of more than 15,000 new telecommunications satellites. An application is already in train for up to 100,000 satellites to be deployed over the next 10 years. Many of these from organizations like Elon Musk's SpaceX, which has applied for consent for 42,000 satellites, Amazon, which has applied for 3,500, and the British-based OneWeb, whose business plan talks about 47,500 satellites. And there are a number of other companies worldwide who plan similar ventures. Ironically, these groups of satellites are called constellations, and they're intended to support the development of high-speed internet connectivity for everyone, everywhere. And whether you consider holistic broadband access a good thing, or perhaps you're worried about the detritus of satellites in the night sky, there is one key concern that we should all have. No one knows what effect the large-scale proliferation of electromagnetic transmission will have upon our planet, because no research has been conducted on its likely effect. But satellites are just the tip of an iceberg of telecommunications revolution, which plans to reshape all of our lives. And it'll suck up global resources at a rate that is barely conceivable. An organization called Greensill Asset Management estimates that by the end of 2020, $2.7 trillion will have been spent on the rollout of 5G technology. That's a value that's higher than the annual GDP of all but 4 countries in the world. Added to this, upgrades of existing infrastructure are forecast to require at least another $1 trillion of expenditure. And licenses for access to increased wave bands from between 3 and maybe 60 gigahertz or more will inevitably reap billions of dollars in revenue for national exchequers. However, this enormous investment doesn't come without other costs. According to a peer-reviewed study by Dr. Anders Andre, who is Huawei's senior expert in technology efficiency, the telecommunications industry will be consuming a massive 20%, a fifth of all global energy production by as soon as 2025, just 5 years' time. And this at a time when we're trying to reduce emissions from generation. And perhaps of more direct concern to individuals, a recent study of research into harm caused by anthropogenic radiation, that's man-made radiation, found that 69% of the studies reviewed evidenced significant biological harm. What is 5G and why are we being told that we need it? The overriding thrust of 5G, as I've just said, is to use new technology to provide ultra high-speed digital connectivity with global coverage. That means improved upload and download speeds and the ability to connect more devices simultaneously to the internet. To enable these benefits, the infrastructure requirement is absolutely enormous. In addition to the 100,000 satellites that I've already mentioned, thousands of new ground-based transmitters and receivers will be required, together with hundreds of millions of repeater antenna. Advocates say that the technology will improve the quality of people's lives. It'll connect rural communities. It'll provide vulnerable people with access to services. It'll help people to work remotely. It'll enable more robust emergency services connectivity. And it's also a prerequisite to the development of smart cities and the introduction of driverless cars and the Internet of Things. The connection of every device in your home, in your office, and workplace. And security forces inevitably see benefits in terms of enhanced surveillance capability. But let me take a step back before moving on to look at harm. I've only referred so far to the infrastructure. What about the communication medium itself? In that sense, we're talking about telecommunications, and we're referring to use of the electromagnetic spectrum. That's a range of frequencies of electromagnetic radiation with associated wavelengths and different levels of photon energy. So starting on the left on this diagram, the peaks and troughs between a single wavelength are longer. So the ultra low frequency wavelength might measure on that left-hand side as much as 100,000 kilometers from peak to peak of a single wavelength. But as you move to the right, the wavelengths become shorter and shorter. So that gamma rays, for instance, are less than 1 picometer in length. That's less than 1 trillionth of a meter. The energy carried by wavelengths is proportional to its frequency. So on the left-hand side of the chart, the photon energy is minimal. But as the wavelength decreases, as you move to the right, the photon energy of the radiation becomes greater and greater. And the more energy the radiation contains, the more damaging it is to all life forms. Of course, we know this because if we have an X-ray in hospital, the staff have got to go and stand behind a lead shield to protect themselves. We're also warned not to spend too much time in the sun because of the damage that ultraviolet light causes to our skin, propensity for cancer. Similarly, at the lower end of the spectrum, we're warned not to stand in front of our microwaves so that we avoid cooking ourselves as well as our meals. The spectrum on the left that encompasses radio and microwave EMF is broadly referred to as non-ionizing. And that means that the wavelengths at that end of the spectrum contain insufficient energy to dislodge an electron from an atom. Now, that's important when it comes to evaluation of safety of the use of these parts of the spectrum for telecommunications, since scientific wisdom developed in the 1950s concluded that the energy from non-ionizing radiation is also insufficient to cause biological harm. Until early last century, most of the EMR that we were exposed to was, of course, natural. But with the advent of radio communications, radar technology, and broadcast television, we've progressively become exposed to more and more man-made anthropogenic radiation. We tend not to think about it because we can't see it. And for most people, but by no means all, we can't feel it. But imagine for a moment if we could see it. From the early days of the BBC in the 1920s and 30s, we now have 47,000 television channels globally. We have 44,000 radio stations globally. And we have an astonishing 4 billion smartphone users, all receiving and transmitting radio frequency radiation. And just imagine, if you could see it, what sort of smog that would create in the air. But for many people, exposure is also more localized. So in Europe and North America, it's estimated that 60% of households now have a home Wi-Fi network. And anthropogenic radiation is different from natural radiation too, and it's deliberately different. It contains packages of data. That's the broadcast content. And that content's packaged in a carrier frequency, which is superimposed within a broadcast frequency. The combination of those three items producing more effect than a single frequency. Most services that we use currently are transmitted within the radio wave spectrum. However, these do have limitations. Firstly, many of the wavelengths that we currently use are already overloaded, and we suffer from variable service quality as a consequence of that. Secondly, for some applications, the transmission speed is simply too slow. They aren't able to carry enough data at high enough speeds for things like effective video streaming, downloading films, games, using CCTV, or indeed things like driverless cars. it would be pointless to have a signal that tells you that you just hit another car. So to achieve higher speeds, you need to have access to higher microwave or millimeter wave frequencies. And this then is at the core of the 5G proposition. And while man-made electromagnetic radiation smog has already increased exponentially, as I've just said, the advent of 5G will make that previous growth look absolutely pedestrian. But delivering 5G signals reliably isn't straightforward. Microwave radiation has both advantages, but also disadvantages. Yes, it'll provide much faster internet speeds with shorter download times, what's called latency, but the signal will only travel short distances, perhaps only 200 to 300 meters. And it doesn't readily penetrate obstacles. So features like trees will disrupt signals. Consequently, a robust 5G service can only be achieved by installation of tens of thousands of base station masts and millions of antennae placed at intervals of no more than 300 meters, using infrastructure like lampposts, telegraph poles, other public infrastructure fixed to office buildings and to people's homes. So in areas where 5G is delivered, you will never be more than 300 meters from a source of telecommunications electromagnetic radiation, and often from multiple sources. But in addition to its ubiquitous nature, 5G will also utilize features that are not consistent with existing forms of radiation. It'll use beamforming and pulse technology, which is expected to be much more damaging. Now, other than military research into the use of microwave radiation, there have been virtually no studies into its effect upon the environment and human health. And the debate about the potential harm is now rife with contention. Industry proclaims that the technology is entirely safe, while an increasingly influential cadre of EMF scientists are sounding stark warnings. And governments are hiding behind safety guidance provided by a profoundly important organization called the International Commission for Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection. I'll shorten that to ICNIRP. In fact, in testimony provided to a United States Senate hearing, major telecommunications companies admitted that they have invested no money in research to establish whether 5G technology is safe, nor are they aware of any such studies. So, to understand the risk that might be associated with 5G, you've got to take a closer look at the effect of the technology that we've already embraced. 2G, 3G, 4G, and services like Wi-Fi and smart meters. These are technologies that we've got in our homes, technologies that we carry in our pockets, technologies that we've come to accept as a cultural norm, providing mobile phone connectivity, wireless internet access, for those that use it, FaceTime and WhatsApp calling and video, and of course services like satellite television and radio. The benefits have been promoted endlessly by an industry that incorporates giants like AT&T, Verizon, Huawei, EE, Vodafone and others, and their platforms are exploited by equally huge organizations like Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and so on. All of those organizations would probably say to you that electromagnetic radiation is safe, that we've been using it for decades without any adverse consequences, and that new technologies will simply be an extension of the same. So it's worth pausing for a moment to mention the regulation of man-made electromagnetic radiation. There are about 3 or 4 bodies that are involved in providing advice on safe exposure to AMR, the most influential of which I've already referred to, which is ICNIRP. ICNIRP is an NGO. It's based in Germany, and it provides guidance on safe exposure to EMF to the World Health Organization, to national governments and regulatory bodies, including here in the UK, to Public Health England and Ofcom. Key to the guidance provided by ICNIRP is an underlying principle established as long ago as the 1950s, that non-ionizing radiation causes harm only at tissue heating levels of exposure, below which they contend there is no biological effect. Accordingly, their guidance is based on limiting the thermal effect of exposure to EMR and restricting exposure to a level that causes no more than 1 degree Celsius increase in core body temperature. Their guidance is based on short-term, 30-minute, low-level exposure to a single source of EMR. However, contrary to ICNIRP's assertions, the authoritative science that is now emerging seems to tell an entirely different story. Why should we be concerned? Well, increasingly, there's a consensus among expert EMF scientists that radio frequency radiation does indeed cause significant biological harm, even at levels of exposure well below ICNIRP's guidelines. In 2012, an expert group of scientists produced the Bioinitiative report, which analysed existing science relating to radio frequency radiation. That report has been continuously updated, with a revised summary issued in 2020. And in that summary, it states that
I found this on the web for a student 2000.
It states 1,800 new studies have been published in the last 5 years, reporting effects at exposure levels 10 to hundreds or even thousands of times lower than those that are allowed under safety limits in most countries of the world. And yet, despite that, no government has instituted any reforms. In 2017, 240 expert scientists and doctors from 40 countries submitted the Scientists' Appeal to the European Union, stating that numerous recent scientific publications have shown that EMF affects living organisms at levels of exposure well below most international and national guidelines. And as at October 2020, that appeal has been endorsed by 407 doctors and scientists with specific knowledge in this field. Separately, the 5G space appeal has been submitted to the United Nations and the World Health Organization, signed by over 320,000 doctors, scientists, and environmental organizations. It appeals for a moratorium on the rollout of 5G. At the heart of the concerns of the scientific community is a body of research which now extends to well over 10,000 studies on the effects of EMF. Illustratively, earlier this year, Dr. Ronald Kostoff, who is a PhD at the Georgia Institute of Technology, published a review of the Medline database of peer-reviewed research on the effects of EMF. That database incorporates 5,400 studies, and Kostoff's conclusion was that the body of research demonstrates grave cause for concern about the health effects of the radiation produced by both existing and proposed technologies. And he went on to say that most studies are inherently conservative and substantially underestimate the risk. A similar study of a review of the ORSA database, that's an Australian database of EMF research, found that just under 3/4 of 1,485 studies identified significant adverse biological effects. An extract of the summary from that ORSA review is illustrated in the slide here, which tabulates the effects identified and the frequency with which those effects were found. The highest instances relate to DNA damage, to oxidative stress, and to increases in free radicals, both of which have a direct association with early stage cancer. Biochemical changes and cell damage also identified, neurological impairment, changes in gene expression, and altered enzyme activity. And of course, there's more. The frequency with which studies find biological harm and the sheer volume of the research is mind-boggling. And still, despite that, the public's told by both industry and government that this technology is safe. But there are two potentially game-changing pieces of recent research which may now challenge that paradigm. So in 2017, the United States National Toxicology Program, the NTP, published the findings of the largest ever study into the effects of continuous exposure to low-level radiofrequency radiation. That's radiation at between 900 and 1800 megahertz. Or to put that in more common terms, that's the same as the radiation emitted by your home Wi-Fi router. The research has since been peer-reviewed and the conclusions made public. And that conclusion is that there is clear evidence of a causal link between radiofrequency radiation and heart schwannoma, or tumor. Clear evidence in the scientific is a scientific term that's used to describe the most conclusive categorization of evidence from a study. And reinforcing the findings of the NTP, a second study conducted by the Ramizzini Institute in Italy published absolutely identical findings, almost concurrently. Now, the replication of results in similar studies is regarded in scientific circles as confirmatory proof. Most notably, the Ramizzini study used even lower levels of exposure than those used in the NTP study. And it was specifically designed to mimic the environmental EMF caused by telecommunications base stations and masts. Both of those studies found consistent evidence of damage to DNA. And the implication is that this isn't simply further inference that the radiation from your cell phone might be harmful. It's clear evidence that electromagnetic radiation emitted by telecommunications infrastructure can and does cause severe biological harm, which can and will adversely affect human health, and by inference, therefore, ecology. So why has nothing been done? Well, the clue may be in an extensive submission presented to the EU Parliament in 2020. It's a report that was conducted by a team of investigative journalists, which suggests large-scale corporate capture perpetrated by the telecommunications industry, with ICNIRP playing a central role. ICNIRP, they contend, is an organization that purports to be independent, which was set up at the instigation of the industry, is funded by industry, and that its work is controlled by industry insiders. Its officers and advisors are appointed internally, and its members all subscribe to the principle that EMR causes only thermal effects. Demonstrating a classic conflict of interests, the report points out that both ICNIRP and World Health Organization's own EMF project, which is a body that is supposed to evaluate ICNIRP's advice, were both chaired by the same individual. Indeed, that individual, while still emeritus chair of ICNIRP, is cited as a senior consultant to the telecommunications industry. Similarly, of the 6 members of the World Health Organization monograph on EMF, and that's the body within the World Health Organization charged with reviewing advice on the effects of EMR, 4 of those members, 4 of those 6 were existing members of ICNIRP, and 1 was a former member. And beyond that, ICNIRP's independence has now been challenged in court. In its decision surrounding a mobile phone court case, the Italian Court of Appeal in Turin in January of this year judged that much of the scientific evidence that excludes carcinogenicity due to radio frequency exposure was in a position of conflict of interest, and that the authors of the study referenced by the defendant are members of ICNIRP and have received directly or indirectly funding from industry. Further, the judgment said that ICNIRP is a private organization whose guidelines on radio frequency have great economic and strategic importance for the telecommunication industry, with which several ICNIRP members have links through consultancy relationships. All of this is highly reminiscent of the corporate capture that was perpetrated by the tobacco industry in the 60s and 70s. In that instance, evidence has demonstrated that the industry was aware of the risk that smoking posed to health, but despite that, it indulged in a campaign of disinformation to protect the economic value of their product. It's now contended that the telecoms industry has commissioned research designed specifically to counter the science that demonstrates harm. And their rhetoric is disconcertingly similar to that of the tobacco industry when they reject evidence of harm. So what next? Well, a number of crucial questions now arise, which I'll attempt to put in context by a statement made by the founder and chief executive of Huawei, one of the world's largest telecommunication businesses. And he has recently said, human societies don't need 5G. They need broadband, which is not a major component of 5G. So what is the telecommunication industry's preoccupation with 5G? And do we want it? And are the perceived benefits worth the risk to human health and the well-being of our global ecology? Even if we did want it, based on $2.7 trillion having been spent already, based on it consuming 20% of the world's energy resources by 2025, can we afford it? Presented with that question, you have to ask yourself, how can an advisory body be reshaped to independently review and balance the science that relates to the safe use of anthropogenic EMF? And having done so, how should the telecommunication industry and the sanctity of our ionosphere be regulated in the future? How indeed can we undo the damage that's already been caused and protect people and ecology from the EMF produced by all wireless technology? Now, I'm not anti-tech. I see the benefits of connectivity, but I am in favor of wired fiber optic networks, because all the science that I've seen, that's the peer-reviewed, credible science, tells me that wireless EMF will be devastating to public health. So a prerequisite for me is to force our respective national governments to commission a truly open, independent, and comprehensive review of the science that demonstrates the harm caused by EMF, and then to act in accordance with those findings to protect public health and our global ecology. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mike. That was a real wake-up call, I think. 5G impacts stretch across so many areas: energy use, ecology, health, atmospheric pollution, with short lifespan, low orbit satellite infrastructure. And I believe I've read that you mentioned fiber optic cables. I believe new research by Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, has found an ultra high speed fiber that is safer and faster than 5G. So that's another point. So without further ado, I'd like just to open the session now to some questions. I'll start with one I found. I'd appreciate our other co-host, Will and Bill, if they've spotted any, there are others to look at. But I'll just start with a question from Andy Waters that says, artificial intelligence will create new jobs, and we now have custom paints and curtains even that can block out man-made radiation. And he believes potentially that 5G companies will invest in this market and create more jobs. Do you have an immediate response to that?
As I said at the outset of this, I'm not anti-tech. I do believe that technology has huge benefits that it can offer to society. What I'm questioning is whether the benefits are outweighed by the risks. AI will definitely produce more jobs. The technology industry as a whole will produce more jobs. The notion, however, that you would be able to block out radiation that is now so ubiquitous, radiation that's going to be beamed down from the satellites, radiation that's going to be fixed at 300-meter intervals virtually on every part of our planet if we follow this plan, is just false. And then you have to consider, how do you protect ecology? I didn't refer to it in this presentation, but there's an equally large body of emerging science about the effects of EMF on wildlife, on ecology. So, for instance, if a human body absorbs radiation to a depth of perhaps a couple of millimeters, and that is sufficient to cause the damage that we're talking about. Imagine if you were a bee, virtually the whole of your body would be penetrated by this radiation. And indeed, bees contain magnetite, and that's one of the reasons that they are severely affected. They also pollinate 2/3 of our crops around the world. So how do you go about protecting our ecology such that you don't damage it? There are studies that look at birds and bird nesting and bird mortality rates of eggs and so on. All of them show dramatic biological effects. So even if you could put a screen around a human being somehow to protect yourself from this radiation, the other dependencies that we have in order to live effectively on this planet all remain exposed to highly damaging sources of radiation. And I think the question is more, how do we regulate this? What is safe? What can we use with confidence? And how do we draw a line between fixed infrastructure and wireless infrastructure so that we achieve the best balance?
Okay, I just picked up another question from Geo Meadows, who says that the frequencies used are similar in 5G, are similar to 4G current frequencies. Could you have a quick response to that? That we've had 4G for some time. There are definitely benefits to it, but you know, they're more or less the same product. Would you agree with that or not?
Okay, let me take that one. It is the case that 5G will start at similar frequencies to those currently used by 4G, or move into what's now called 4G LTE. There are some significant differences about the way in which that's transmitted in a 5G context. So, as I said earlier, it will be pulsed and beamed, and the energy content of it will be considerably higher than conventional 4G. But notwithstanding that, the body of scientific evidence that I've referred to is looking at the technologies that we're already using. It's looking at 2G, 3G, and 4G, which we've all been told is safe thus far. But all of the body of scientific evidence, which appears credible, which isn't funded by industry, and which has been peer-reviewed, demonstrates that even the wavelengths that we're using at the moment have serious consequences for public health and for ecology.
Yes. I mean, another point I think about is that our phone screen addiction, this 5G project, is there to feed our phone screen addiction, which is bad enough already. And we're spending trillions of dollars on this. And that is probably, well, definitely in my view, money that could be better spent on promoting a Green New Deal and the millions of jobs that could be created there.
I think you're getting into the territory of the merits of the digital world. And I guess if you were following the US election at the moment, you might say that it's got benefits and disbenefits in terms of the quality and integrity of information. But notwithstanding that, there will be many people who see the advantages of being connected through social media and other platforms. I have no issue with that at all. If that's useful for people staying connected, if it's useful to people to receive information about the world in which they live and to connect in a meaningful way, I don't have any problem with any of that at all. I think there are social issues about overuse, but that's an entirely different issue to me. The issue that I have is simply whether or not we've got the right balance of use of wireless technology, whether we understand its consequences on health and ecology, and how indeed we're going to cut through the smoke of disinformation that appears to be being promoted by industry and take a really good look at the high quality peer-reviewed science that's telling us we need to look at this carefully, we need to take it seriously, and we need to make sure that we protect ourselves and our planet.
Okay. I don't know whether our co-hosts can just screen through any more questions. There certainly are some. I'm going down the list as we speak, but can Will or Bill just spot any more questions further down that we can put?
I rather like the one raised by Amanda Barton because it is contingent with a study I did. The question relates to whether the availability or extraction costs of the rare metals and minerals for the technology and infrastructure to build all this will limit coverage. Will richer countries be more able to do it, and will the poor ones just fall further behind? I think that's what she's saying. Is there any carbon offsetting for the whole life cost of all this infrastructure? You know, you do wonder whether there's enough energy to do all this and build all the new wind farms and solar panels to create the electricity to power all of this. You know, we're trying to do an awful lot here all at once. What have you got to say, Mike?
Well, I think Amanda hits a very important point, really. There is the question of whether or not our natural resources have the capacity to keep pace with this. There are precious metals that are required in this technology. There's mining consequences. There's energy consequences that you've just alluded to. You know, I think we're trying to decarbonize our world to protect ourselves from climate change. It's decidedly unhelpful to have an industry that is going to consume energy at a higher rate than we're switching to green. So I think it does present some real conundrums for us if this sort of technology gains real momentum, and it is gaining real momentum. And then, of course, there's the financial resources. You know, at a time when we're seeing poverty rising exponentially around the world, and certainly not helped by the current coronavirus situation, then countries' financial resources are going to be substantially stretched. Businesses' financial resources are going to be substantially stretched. And I suspect the development of this technology is going to become progressively focused to a smaller and smaller number of bigger and bigger organizations that can leverage the capital that's required to do this. But make no mistake, if you're investing trillions of dollars in new infrastructure, you're going to require a return on that investment. And there is trillions of dollars of revenue at stake here. There's economic value, which is difficult to get your head around, which is going to drive this demand to consume world resources.
I see that Andy Waters has raised another issue about solar storms releasing huge bursts of electromagnetic radiation that could actually impact and knock down our ever-growing infrastructure, IT infrastructure. The last, as I recall, there was a huge one before we had new information technology, and that was in, I think, early this century, if I'm right. It could be within the end of the last one. But I mean, this is another area people just don't think. There's no plan B now for what happens if there's been a major impact on our technology infrastructure. Even nuclear power stations, they require functioning electronic systems to keep the pumps and the water flowing to cool the reactor. So what do you have something just to say on that briefly?
I'm afraid you're straying into territory that I'm not familiar with, so I'm not going to try and talk about something I don't know about, but it wouldn't surprise me if solar flares and so on have an impact on
I believe there was,
technology.
well, there's certainly in recent years, there was a major solar flare that knocked out a lot of the electrical infrastructure in the east coast of the United States for a couple of days. But that's not as high as the one that occurred, the event that occurred, I think, much earlier in the 20th century. But I'd have to look that one up. But it's another thing for us to think about. You know, there's no plan B in case this infrastructure breaks down because of a major solar flare event.
Well, there's no plan B to our planet being our home and the natural resources that we have at our disposal. And I think the message of this is we need to take good care of it.
True. I mean, I don't know, have our co-hosts got any more questions?
I like this one. It's actually Will Saunders, one of the co-hosts. Apologies if I missed this, but I'd like clarification myself. Is Wi-Fi okay? Because that seems to be bordering on the 5G frequencies. Mike?
Okay. Most Wi-Fi in a domestic setting is between 900 and 1800 or 1900 megahertz. Some of it goes up to an option which I think is 5000 megahertz, which you can switch between. The science that I've referred to today, as I mentioned when I talked about the NTP and the Ramazzini studies, refers directly to wavelengths that are used for Wi-Fi. So my message to anyone today is by no means take your Wi-Fi, your home Wi-Fi, for granted. There is ample evidence now to demonstrate that long-term exposure to Wi-Fi frequencies causes severe harm. And if you can move to fixed Ethernet cables, then you will be helping the health consequences for yourself and your family.
Okay, well, we're coming to an end fairly soon now, but
could I ask you a question?
Oh, sorry, does somebody have a question there?
Yes, this is Paul. In my screen, I'm next to you.
Oh.
I put it on the chat, but do you see it or may I speak it?
Well, do speak it. I'm looking for it on the screen, but please do speak.
That's all good. You may have already answered one of my two interrelated questions. I'm a historian, and I'm reminded of the American dependence on slavery in the 18th and 19th century. It was a widespread norm. It produced great wealth. Critics of slavery looked eccentric. It was too big to fail. Is our dependence on harmful technologies too big to
Too big to fail?
I think you might have just answered. Too big to fail was my last question, but I think you might have already answered my second interrelated question. Are there less bad, better, or even good alternatives for healthy uses of these wonder technologies?
Wow. Well, Paul, thank you for those questions and the points that you've made. The key question, is it too big to fail? I think is a really difficult one to address. You know, when you have so much economic value behind this, derailing it is really difficult if you can't get legislators behind it. And legislators are subject to the vagaries, obviously, of lobbyists, and indeed some of these very influential advisory organizations. So I think it is a significant risk. It troubles me greatly that this has got so much momentum that it's going to be almost impossible to stop. Probably the key to that is acknowledging that ICN IRP is the preeminent advisory body which has now been discredited, in my view. It's been found in a court of law to be in conflict. If that can be replaced with an independent body that gives the World Health Organization United Nations and governments around the world, balanced advice based on the real science, then we probably have a chance to do something about this. And I don't think it's necessarily about employing whole-scale other technologies. It's probably a question of striking the right balance to do the best that we can to protect public health and ecology, given that we have got so used to mobile technology actually driving a lot of what we do. So if you're in an office environment, if you're in your home environment and you're wanting to connect to the internet, or you're wanting to use the telephone, you can use fixed infrastructure. If you're out in the environment trying to find someone who's been lost on a moor as a member of the emergency services and you need to be in touch, your only option is some form of mobile communication. So I think it's striking the right balances. You know, these organizations have got technology that, used correctly, I'm sure can advance humankind and can give us the benefits that we need to give us a better quality of life. But we need to be mindful, we need to be careful of those bits that are damaging. We need to be open enough and honest enough to recognize the bits that are and to try and mitigate that.
Well, you provide wise suggestions, and it apparently took a war to end slavery in the 19th century. And you're offering suggestions about things we can do, since we're still relatively early in this problem, before it becomes such a total crisis that it would take some similar crisis to solve it.
I can't believe that there aren't people in the industry who know about the risk associated with this. You know, most big organizations have research and development teams, they have health and safety teams who understand these things intimately. The tobacco industry had this. And there is absolutely clear evidence from what emerged from the tobacco industry that all of these businesses knew the risk associated with their product. I have no doubt that the telecommunications industry is probably the same. I suspect that people may start to break ranks when they realize what the science really says. And I think those sorts of things, if we can establish an honest dialogue about this, will have profound influences on the decisions that boards of directors take and non-executives in those boards take.
There might be some people here watching today who could be some of those influencers. Go for it.
It would be wonderful.
Yeah, can I get in a related question here, Johnny Payne? Because it's difficult to be a whistleblower when your job depends on it and your family. You began your talk, Mike, with the mention of the infrastructural costs of 5G being an initial 2.7 trillion with 1 trillion upkeep costs. Do you have any information about the number of jobs that 5G will create and maintain? This is a constant thing that comes up, isn't it? All these things, oh, they create jobs. You want jobs, don't you?
Absolutely.
How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of interrelated points here. You know, we are talking about the economic model, and the economic model provides employment, it provides shareholder return, it provides taxes to the exchequer. So you know, the benefits are not simply the service benefits that these technologies deliver. They deliver fundamental benefits to society and employment and taxation revenues that get spent on social infrastructure and socially delivered services. So we shouldn't take that lightly. But if this science is right, we have to look at it. We have to take note of it. We've seen a huge emergence of neurodegenerative disease over the last 20 years. We've seen spikes in cancer. We're now up to likelihood is 3 in 4 that you will suffer from cancer during your life. This research is telling us that radio frequency radiation may be a contributory factor to that. We know that it is a contributory factor to some forms of cancer and to DNA damage and other things. Now, if I was asked to balance the benefit that this technology sector offers in terms of jobs against the damage that it might do to human health and to ecology, I would vote to have a look at the damage to health and the damage to ecology very carefully before I elected to take the benefit of jobs. And some of those jobs will be a substitution from other industries as well. So, you know, I think it's a very difficult balance. I'm not sitting here today with a definitive answer. I'm trying to promote a warning that there is such an enormous body of profoundly good quality scientific research here that says this is a problem, that we must stop and take stock of this. We must look at it carefully. We must make decisions and judgments that are going to protect public health and the ecology of our planet in the long term.
Yes, and we must remember that this huge 5G rollout that's taking place is all taking place without our informed consent. And we surely need to challenge local authorities and national governments on this issue.
Well, it might be worth just picking up one point there. I mean, it's very pertinent what you say, Brian. There is the legislation that's been passed, for instance, in the UK, that now prohibits citizens and local authorities from contesting the development of telecommunications infrastructure on the grounds of concern about harm to health. I think that's an insidious thing to have happened. It removes democracy from the process, and it makes us impotent to do something about something about a subject which may be of serious concern to local residents.
Absolutely, Mike. I'm sure a lot of us weren't aware of that very important point. I don't know, any final question we can see here? I haven't been looking at the questions on the chat just recently. Has anyone got a final question? And then we'll close the meeting. I'll say first that do stay, well, not stay, but join us at 3 o'clock when our next event comes up today on the nature theme. And so if there's no further questions,
Hello?
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 Who's that? You had Patty McGrath.
This is Patty from the US, from Maryland. And
Hello.
my question is about self-driving cars, which are supposedly going to be able to revolutionize the use of automobiles so that everyone doesn't have to own an automobile that sits for 95% of its time in one stationary place and doesn't go anywhere, just so that we can go someplace by automobile when we need to. So self-driving cars is a real future development that has all kinds of positive ramifications. But my understanding is that the entire thing won't work without 5G. And so do you know if that is absolutely true, or is this just a pipe dream being associated with a deadly technology in order to make it more palatable?
I'm not an expert in this area, Patty, but as you say, my understanding of this is that you cannot have driverless vehicles en masse without a robust 5G network.
Ah, so it is true. Okay.
I've got a question here I'd like to throw in.
Thank you.
I think it's important. Andy Fitzgerald, I think it's Andy, he's come up before. Question, Mike, do you have any suggestions as to how we persuade other environmentalists in the UK and elsewhere, presumably, to engage in the issue of wireless pollution? He says he's been trying to do so for over a decade, but it seems to be a taboo subject. They don't want to get involved in it. That's my experience as well, actually.
Yeah, it is quite remarkable, and the potential effect on ecology it's just colossal. And I find it extremely difficult to understand why organizations like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth don't have a core strategy that looks not really at 5G per se, but actually at electromagnetic radiation in its broadest sense. I've tried to engage directly with several of these organizations, and as you say, they don't appear to want to get involved in the debate. You know, maybe that is, from their perspective, simply a question of their capacity. You know, they are very active in climate change, in trying to protect forestry, in marine pollution, and so on. And maybe there are only so many things that you can prosecute with any great effect. I don't know whether that's the barrier to their involvement. I think it would be hugely helpful if there was a consensus in this area, and if people could join together to call for this review of the science. You know, I am not going to sit here today and say that the science that I've reviewed is the be all and end all, but I do believe that there is ample reason to set up a truly comprehensive, independent and open review of the science. And if you get some of these big organizations behind it, we're more likely to get traction in that argument.
Well, there's a good action point for everyone, Mike. I think we'll better close the meeting now, just to remind everyone that this talk has been recorded and will be available on the Scientist Warning website and on our new YouTube channel very soon, hopefully next week. So I'll close the meeting down in a minute and just say one final reminder that we have another event coming up at 3 o'clock today, which I hope many of you will join. So I will just shut the meeting down now, and if Will could just, I'll even have a go at turning off the recording.